everyone. Welcome to this first season of the Autonomous Health Podcast. We talk to scientists, innovators, entrepreneurs, VCs at the intersection of bringing machine learning and artificial intelligence to healthcare. This is me, Anmol, with a couple of really special guests this afternoon. So we have Jeff and Leon, who are co-founders of a really compelling company called Rise Sleep. Hey, Jeff. Hey, Leon.
Hey.
Hey.
Good to be here, Anmol.
Not as good as seeing you in person, Anmol. It's always better in person, but this works.
Yeah, well, we'll take what we can get, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so the whole point of this podcast, guys, is we bring in people who are scientists, entrepreneurs, executives, AI researchers. We talk about healthcare, we talk about wellness, we talk about the role that these technologies are playing in shaping people's lives. And there's so much going on in our field, and we like to try to pick certain examples that highlight what this means for all of us every day and where the industry is going. Where is the puck going? So we kind of skate in that direction. So I'm excited you guys are here. And I think before we talk about sleep and all these interesting things that you're working on, maybe if you could both just take a couple of minutes, talk about yourselves and introduce yourselves, tell us your story. Yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, happy to give the overview of how we got into this. I think our story at this point is pretty inseparable, but Leon and I got started in sleep back in 2010. We were engineers and we'd be up late at night on problem sets, up early in the morning, just feeling like crap, absolute shit. You probably remember those days, Animal. And we wanted to find out what we needed to do to feel better. And as you would expect, engineers to do, we went to the peer-reviewed literature and tried to find what is it that determines how you feel? And we sort of struggled to find the answer on our own. It actually wasn't until we started doing independent studies in sleep science that we started to get a bit more color on what do you need to do to feel better? And actually our first initial set of research, I want to even say was in part inspired by the work you did at the Media Lab on passive sensing. And we wanted to figure out, could we actually help people with sleep behavior change? Could we make an impact with all the data that was coming from wearables? And so that was the first set of research that we published. And long story short, the way this turned into a business was the elite athletic world was interested in improving sleep for performance. And so very quickly working with teams like the Patriots and Clemson and Alabama, and really got to see firsthand how you can actually better predict on field performance, how people are feeling, sales performance within corporations, all through a lot of the metrics we're collecting while people are sleeping. And so, happy to share what we're seeing. I think we've
Before you share what we're seeing, we actually also need to hear from Leon, and I want to hear him introduce his journey as well, and then we'll connect the dots, and then I want to hear how you guys met and why you decided to start a company together, and then we'll talk about what athletes need.
Okay.
Yeah, we can jump into it. So I'm, a little more on the personal side. I grew up in Panama, made the migration to Chicago for college, and I wasn't really aware winter was a real winter, but I show up without a jacket to Chicago and quickly had to get a new jacket. But that's kind of where doing sort of a mix of computer science and industrial engineering. And I sort of met Jeff very quickly on my freshman year. Jeff was a year older than me. And very quickly was Jeff had all this interesting stuff around, sleep deprivation. And I was the exact opposite, which I thought sleep was a massive waste of time. I'll sleep when I'm dead, I just want to kind of have to be early for school and then want to be late at parties, whatever. And then turns out that was just a bad idea. And took me surprisingly long time to put two and two together, that the reason I was so tired all the time was because I was just running on 5 hours of sleep. So long story short, I think that's when, Jeff and I just started running a bunch of just experiments, and there's kind of all sort of absurd stories, but Jeff would live in his house and he would just walk under candlelight at night. And got me into that habit of literally not having electric lighting after sunset, and instead having, carrying a light, to keep, the lux levels low before bed, and all that sort of stuff. And really trying to experiment with how sleep actually works and how that impacts what we do. And slowly we just experimented more into a company, but that's kind of the beginning of the journey.
Yeah, and then when companies get started, right? Like you meet people and you're like, "Yeah, we should start a company." Was that pretty obvious to you guys when you guys met, or did somebody be like, did sort of that take time? Like there are people you work with. I'm like, yeah, I'm probably going to go start a company with that person at some point, and that happens once in a while. And what was that experience like? And now 12 years later, and we'll talk about today where you guys are. But
Yeah, I mean, Leon, you probably have your own version of it, and I think there's many different moments when we had to recommit to actually taking something commercial that was just a fascination. It started, Leon and I were in a bunch of classes together. I remember one optimization class we took, and we are trying to optimize like schedules for like the operating room surgery environment. And I remember being in a group project with Leon, and like I was trying my best to work hard, but like Leon was so clearly far above my capacity from an IQ standpoint to be able to pull this project off. And he was able to basically do it single handedly. And I was like, huh, all right, like no one else was able to do it.
while running on 5 hours of sleep, apparently. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
like I want to go. Yeah, even with 5 hours sleep deprivation, I want to go work with that guy. And then I think that just started our relationship of trying to do hard things and do experiments and do things that no one else was really doing while we were in engineering school. And
yeah.
we both ended up doing our own majors. Mine more on like complex systems, and Leon more on the data science side. But we just had a blast trying to solve these problems. And then like because we were in school and we could take independent studies, we could like go start working with Northwestern football, and like we had all this incredible data, and then we'd go and take like a machine learning class and say, okay, how do we actually predict like the velocity of like someone lifting a bar, and what are the models that are even going to work here? And so like a lot of our learning really came from kind of this applied problem solving set, and that was just I think a ton of fun. It made the work a lot more fun and made class more engaging. So that was kind of a fun hack at the time. But yeah, for me, it was that moment where Leon's skill set technically was way far beyond what I could do. And while I had a good sense of the literature base, like we also needed to build software. And I think there was just that match of someone to build and someone that needs to sell. And like any company, you probably need at least those two types of people. But I think we were able to bond over like the technical aspects of it. So it was fun.
Yeah, the thing that I often talk about is like in companies as you're growing, you're either building or you're selling, right? So it's one of those two jobs. And sometimes the same person is doing both and everybody's doing both. So yeah. Leon, I don't know if you wanted to add color to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think in hindsight, it's sometimes super hard to find like what's the moment. At least like from our journey, it was just like there were a lot of key moments, but I would say one probably of the main tipping points was at one point we're still like running experiments and like trying to figure things out. Like, is there like a little project we can do with? And Jeff calls me one day, I think right before the summer, and he's like, I went to pitch to the head of Northwestern football training staff that I wanted to do a small research project with 5 people, five of the players over their kind of like summer camp to see if, like we can see how sleep predicts their football performance. And the head of athletic training was like, I don't want a 5-person research little pilot. I want like to get the 120 players sleeping better, right, tomorrow. And by the way, we start literally in like 2.5 weeks, right? And I think Jeff calls me over. He's like, come right now to the House of Beer or some beer spot in Evanston. And he's like, we have to build some sleep improvement technology for Northwestern football. And we launch in 3 weeks. So I think that was the most like clear external forcing function of like, I think I had an internship back then. So I was like nights and weekends trying to say like, all right, let's build the minimum viable MVP type experience of like, how do you even try to track and measure, the sleep of 120 athletes, right? So that's like one of the, I would say like key moments of the, definitely pre-company formation, but like a lot of the things coming together into like, all right, we have almost like a someone demanding, a solution for a problem, the ability to kind of sell and build. And also like a clear timeline, like if we deliver, we sort of have some sort of compensation attached to it. So that was a key moment.
Yeah.
And so I think everybody here is aware, but it's so important that it's worth reinforcing this. But sleep is so fundamental in our lives. There is, for all of us as consumers, sleep is, one of the sort of fundamental base systems that we need working and optimizing. And I'm sure you guys have a lot to share on that and a lot to say on that. Both in terms of your theses, but also where you think the science is going. But then we also have, call it these extreme situations or settings. And, we've had on season 1 as well, one of our other guests is a sleep scientist who works with fighter pilots and astronauts and others, and sort of how do you do sleep for those settings. And you've got athletes, you've got people who work high stress jobs on things like oil rigs, you've got people who work off cycle in schedules. So these sort of very extreme, if you think of it as a continuum, there's like elite athletes on one end of the spectrum and fighter pilots on that end of the spectrum, and then you've got everybody else on the other end of the spectrum, and then in between you have people with kids and families and all those sorts of things. But all of us are trying to optimize and improve sleep. Are there certain lessons that you all learned working with athletes, working with people in high performance situations, that you thought were really surprising? Either the literature was surprising, or as you were building products for that market and for that audience, you were surprised by what was working or what needed to happen. What is hard or special about getting 120 college athletes to sleep better? And is that the same as just all of us, or is there fundamentally something different about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that just hit us over the head, whether it was like the first team we worked with or like the last, is that like no one cares about sleep. I think most people realize that.
Yeah.
And I think for us, one of the main lessons that like not caring about sleep sort of perpetuated a lot of different ways. Obviously 2012 is very different than 2020, where now there's a lot more awareness about how important it is. But one of the lessons that we've taken to heart is just like how important it is that you don't require people to spend time or money on tracking their sleep. Like, how do we do it with devices they already have? And that's a really hard technical problem to solve. But for the user experience, it's simple. I just want my sleep data. I don't want to do anything about it. And it's because people don't really care about sleep. What they do care about, and what the players would like line up for and the coaches cared about, everyone really cared about, is how do I feel better during the day? Like, I want to feel better. In sport, you can measure that quantifiably by like, your 3-point percentage, your point per minute efficiency, your play execution likelihood. So I think the major surprising thing, Animal, was just that like no one cared about sleep. Like, people cared about how they felt during the day. And the more we could do to connect how you're sleeping with how you're feeling, the more that people would care about changing something that has to do with their sleep. And so I even think, back to our story of how we got into this, it took us a really long time to realize the reason we felt so bad. For some people that can mean and manifest as like, I'm anxious, I don't feel as sharp as I used to, I'm not able to lose the weight I want, my skin health doesn't look good. Like, name an outcome that you care about. Like, the root cause, at least one of the major root causes to that, is sleep. It's sort of the foundation of all of health. And so it's just easy to let go. And the more we could connect it to how people were feeling during the day, the better. And that's maybe one of the big misunderstandings I think about sleep science, is it should really be called like sleep and wakefulness science. I know that's like a long, very long-winded field, but the research base,
very buzzy, definitely lands. That one definitely lands.
The research base is all about like, how do you tie what sleep behaviors are driving how people feel during the day? And there's all sorts of outcome measures. And so I think the thing that blew our mind is like, it actually doesn't matter. Like, whether you're an athlete or you're a mom with 2 kids or you're an Uber driver that has a mental health issue, like, sleep is just as important. And I think what got us to start to focus on mid-2018, building for all of us, was just this realization that like, life is too short to win Super Bowls. And there's a lot of people that could benefit from the lessons that we had learned. So I think just how pervasive the impact of sleep is on everything you do is just surprising, and continues to be, surprising to this day.
Yeah. And I would add maybe that there's kind of one aspect of sleep science, and really goes under the realm of chronobiology, that always blows people's mind, and it's sometimes counterintuitive. And that is how much light and light exposure affects sleep. And it takes a bit to get used to it, but like, the main external factor that tells your body to regulate what's called circadian rhythm is light exposure. And what happened over the last 150 years is that we figure out how to have, 24/7 electric lighting. And that's something our biology never was used to. And that was like a drastic change. So little things like getting a lot of outdoor lighting in the morning and very little light at, in the evening time can have like huge impacts in leading to like consistent sleep and ultimately better sleep. And it's one of those things that it takes a while to, put together. Even though you hear a lot of like, oh, your phones and screen times have negative consequences, but just in general, putting aside the phones, just light exposure and the impact it has for benefit and for negative at the right time can be extremely counterintuitive. And when thought about properly, can lead to a ton of huge benefit. So that keeps surprising me all the time.
Yeah. So just to restate the importance of what you said there, Leon and Jeff, is light exposure, body clock, circadian rhythm. I mean, these are the things that are surprisingly, obviously, evolution has shaped our behavior for millions of years, right? And so they obviously are well sort of programmed and engineered into how we function as human beings. But they're surprisingly important, even in this day and age, when you think of whether it's improving the 3-point average for a college athlete based on their mood, or just being more productive as a parent or as a professional in our society.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because in many other conditions, like in chronic conditions, for example, we've often spoken about the importance of lifestyle and behavior change. And I would argue that we don't quite understand every aspect of our lives that well, especially when it comes to things like, why does intermittent fasting work for some people and not others, right? There's probably something about the way we process glucose, the way our body processes these different elements, and those are clusters of behaviors that exist, or phenotypes of behavior that exist in human population. Or in mental health, one of the common themes that we often see again and again is there are many different ways in which a particular diagnosis of depression might show up in a person. And again, there are many different ways in which that works. But I think if I'm hearing you say this correctly, and if I'm internalizing this correctly, you're saying sleep is a much more constrained set.
Yeah. I mean, it's to the point where like we used to joke about it. Like, you don't need big data and like unsupervised machine learning models. Like the models we're using to predict circadian rhythm are like fully deterministic based on they're a set of differential equations. Like that's the level that we can predict like the phase response curve of light and all of the like. We don't need to use more advanced. Those are unique methods, but like we understand the dynamic systems very well. And that's, I think, unique compared to nutrition, compared to mental health, where I think like we don't even understand the inputs and outputs well enough to like have sort of like deterministic closed form model.
We barely understand the gut microbiome and the impact that has on nutrition, and like why.
Right.
And we're getting better every day. I mean, don't get me wrong, this changing very rapidly, and there's so many incredible researchers and scientists driving the way forward. But it's still a very complex problem to parse.
What's surprising to me, because now we've been a little bit on the science side and sort of doing literature reviews, and like, Leon and I aren't PhDs. We've I think our names are on like a couple papers as like last authors or something. But we're familiar with the literature base, and hopefully we're like numerically somewhat literate. And the pretty clear, screaming big result from the last 100 years of sleep science is that there's basically this grand theoretical model that is it exactly true? I don't think so, but I think it's a helpful model for understanding. And it's called the 2-factor model of sleep and wake regulation. Basically says if you want to predict someone's state of wakefulness at any time during the day, there are 2 factors. One is sleep debt, or sort of the sleep homeostat. So sort of like hunger, it's just, linearly, every minute you're awake, it linearly increases. So that's sleep debt. In our work, we've seen that the last 14 nights of sleep will actually affect how you feel today. Things like mood state, things like, so, on the cognitive side, physiological side, but then, I mean, also performance, whether it's in sales or sport or whatever. And then you've got the second factor, which is, we've talked about the circadian rhythm, and that has this sort of sinusoidal shape, and that changes in response to lighting mostly. And so if you want to understand how someone is going to be feeling and sort of how biologically awake they are at any moment, like those are the 2 factors to understand. And what the research doesn't say, if anyone's listening to this and they're probably using a sleep app or have a Fitbit or an Apple Watch, what the research doesn't say is that sleep staging matters for wakefulness. In fact, it shows the opposite, that sleep staging doesn't predict people's subjective state of alertness. And I think that's a really sort of
And for the sake of everyone here, can you just elaborate on what you mean by the word staging in this
yeah.
context?
So sleep staging being like deep sleep, REM sleep, light sleep, the amounts that you get, and sort of again, our theory is like sleep it's in every living being. It's evolved for millions of years. It's highly complex and adaptive, and so what we know is that depending on what you do during the day and the amount of sleep you've had sort of prior,
Yeah.
your brain is adjusting what stages you get in what amounts. All stages are important, and so if you go listen to like 50 other sleep podcasts or people talking about sleep, they're going to be like, sleep quality is everything, and REM sleep, and you need deep sleep. And the research seems pretty clear. And so I think what's interesting and always has been to me and Leon is like, are these executives or folks that are entrepreneurs just not spending time in the literature base? Like, and if they're not doing it in sleep, are they not doing it in other fields like mental health or like just, it seems like there needs to be a pretty close connection to what the evidence base is. And then there has to be willing to obviously like innovate on that change. But
I think there's also a fair question to be asked of how accurately can you actually sense those sleep stages using basically consumer devices, right? So if you're
yeah,
either using some measure from either direct contact or visual sort of reading things through the skin, or if it's an accelerometer based kind of measurement, how accurately can you really predict the different sleep stages to that level of accuracy that you might be able to do in like a real setting in the sleep lab?
yeah, well, and we had one of our advisors, Jamie Zeitzer, who co-heads Stanford Sleep Research Center, was telling me a story. Part of this might be apocryphal, but I think it kind of goes to illustrate the point, which is his advisor was Bill Dement, who like really was he started back at U Chicago, and I think in the 30s, and he was telling the story how I think in the 50s they had the ability for the first time to do polysomnography, 40s and 50s do polysomnography.
Right.
And they all were getting together, the Italian scientists, the German scientists, the US scientists. They're all trying to agree on like, how do we want to descriptively talk about the brain waves that we're sort of rudimentarily sensing and able to see on the sort of sheets. And the like Italians wanted like 10 stages, and the Germans wanted like 7, and the Americans wanted 4 or whatever. And they ultimately agreed on what we have now, and the system's gotten sort of slightly improved. But I think it's a descriptive system. I don't know if it's a predictive system. And the research is sort of like, there's no clear research that staging is really critical. We do know that staging somehow has correlates with what's going on, but Jamie has done some fascinating work to look at is there a new way to even describe what's happening in the brain? And is REM, deep sleep, light sleep, are those even useful?
Yeah.
Like they do describe consistently what's going on at a very high level, but is that useful other than being able to talk about brainwave changes? That's, I think, still an unknown area in the literature right now.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think if we look at where we are as a society, right? I mean, you guys have been part of this whole journey, and 10 years ago, when you were getting started, 12 years ago, measuring sleep was still a very uncommon idea, right? I mean, we were starting to talk about it as a society, but people didn't have consumer devices like they do, and now there are tens of millions of devices sold, as well as mobile apps like yours that are doing this. Obviously, you guys have achieved a lot in that period, right? So, for those listening and don't know, Rise is a top 20 sleep app or consumer wellness app globally and focused on sleep. Jeff and Leon are both interesting entrepreneurs in 30 under 30 winners and all sorts of accolades, right? So the world has changed. But if we think of where we're going forward, it's not just about measuring and understanding sleep, it's also about how you change and manipulate sleep. And if we use a lens of like these new technologies have kind of messed up, the things that we were programmed to do because of evolution, but now we want to take control back, and we want to create systems or approaches or techniques that allow us to switch the way we operate. What does that world look like? So like a crazy idea, right? Just to start thinking in that, which is, at what point does Rise have a feature in the app that says you're flying international in a week? This is your new sleep schedule and you should start doing it now. Or next month you are working the night shift 2 nights out of 5 as a nurse or whatever you profession you're in that requires that. And this is what you should start doing now for light as well as for when you sleep, because it sounds like there's only 2 or 3 things that really matter. And it's not a very complex problem to sort of predict what should be done. And so it's sort of like the first step of any machine learning AI system is understand. In this case, it's a constrained set of dimensions to understand and model. And then the next step is actuate and change. And in your case, then the question becomes, how do we sort of basically, program humans or create tools that allow humans to take control back over sleep and still adapt to the changing lifestyles, but do it on our terms and with the level of wellness and energy that people are seeking. Is that the future? Is that where the world goes after it's the next 10 years of sleep science?
Yeah, I mean, I can give some perspective, and then Leon, I'm curious to get your perspective. I mean, I think what we've seen and what's made up, there's a lot of sleep apps out there that do sleep tracking. I think what separates our approach is, to my knowledge, we're still the only sleep app, if you will, that's really built around energy management. And so what we've done and tried to focus on, what we think really people care about at the end of the day, is how they feel. And we've seen that with athletes, with regular people. And what we do differently is really focus on how do you not just track sleep, but how do you help someone manage their energy throughout the day. And so the way that we do that is with the 2-factor model that we talked about earlier. We have algorithms that determine someone's sleep need, which is largely a genetic factor, and 8 hours and 15 minutes with a 35-minute standard deviation. So there's a wide kind of dispersion of genetics that create sleep need. We can then calculate your sleep debt for you. We can then keep track of that, and that number becomes really a key metric for how you feel. It allows you to prioritize: should I watch Netflix? Should I not? And then the second is the circadian, what we call energy schedule, but it's a visualization of your circadian rhythm throughout the day. And so I think the missing piece, and where the research is not super clear, and what I think is really exciting is, okay, great, we're capturing a lot of how people feel through these 2 measures and really helping people make better decisions based off of it. But is there a way that we could fully close the loop and really say, for you, animal, here are all the factors, not just sleep and circadian, but here's how your nutrition is factoring into how much energy you have. Here's how your exercise is playing a role.
Yeah.
Here's how much time spending at home is playing a role. And so I think one of the major questions is, like, what are even the right output measures? Like, is the right output measure psychomotor vigilance, which we can measure? Is it mood state? Like, what is it for people? And in the sleep science research, they call this difference between fatigue and sleepiness.
Mm-hmm.
And so fatigue is the state of, like, let's assume that you slept really well, you have no sleep debt, and like you just had a really hard day. By the end of the day, all you want to do is sit down and have a beer. You're just like fatigued, your brain is tired, even though you're not sleepy. And so I think really trying to get specific on like how we capture the right output measures and evolving the field in a way that's not just talking about, hey, can we predict sort of sleep pressure? Can we predict your core body temperature at any point during the day? Can we predict, your performance on a psychomotor vigilance task? But how do we evolve it to a more, like, what people care about at the end of the day is, how am I feeling today? And do I know what the inputs are that's going to drive it? And how do we help people make those decisions? So that's still kind of an unknown area, which is kind of exciting, because that's, I think, the thing that people want more around. But Leon, go ahead.
Yeah, and what's interesting, Animal, is that you maybe describe the system as a little bit of a set of like fixed constraints, which in many ways a fundamental system is. But humans are messy, lives are messy, and while I would say the science, like, sometimes the answer is like, yeah, if you know perfect information, yeah, there's like the right recommendation for you at the right time to optimize your goals, right? Like, if you're traveling tomorrow to Europe and you're going to be jet lagged and you have an important presentation 2 days from now, we could give you like the optimal recommendation. So you're going to be at your best in your UK time zone at the time of your important meeting, let's say. But the realistic case of like, right, most people have a lot of things going on in life, right? Like, they could have personal issues at home. They could have a demanding boss. They could have like a really important hobby that they're like staying up late at night because like they care about a personal project. And you might not be able to measure every little thing. So to be able to have the right behavior loops, like how do you actually change behavior? while managing some of this somewhat imperfect information, I think is where I think tech as a collective unit still kind of like has ways to go. And I would say like one of the kind of simple examples, but I think maybe shows this is there's a lot of people, if someone has an Apple Watch, a lot of people do, or even if, many of the, step trackers, and you're like in your car, commuting back from work, stuck in traffic, and the thing tells you like, oh, you've been sitting down for too long, stand up.
Yeah.
And when you talk to people that have that experience, they're like, man, that just made me feel like crap, right? Like, I can't stand up right now. I know I haven't been moving because I've been sitting all day working and now I'm stuck in traffic for an hour. Are you really trying to make me stand up right now? Like, that just makes me like feel guilty about myself. Like, it's not motivating or so. And obviously that's a simple example. I think making that sort of a big picture, how does that always give you the right information at the right time is where we have long ways to go. But
Yeah, I think like human context is a really hard problem, right? And I mean, let's use Google Assistant or some of these tools where they've got hundreds of people working on some of these teams, tens of people working on these teams, and I think it's really hard, even at that scale, to nail human context effectively, where there's a lot of use cases and a lot of complexity in a person's day. And but I think the place where this gets interesting is maybe it's like a few things that disrupt sleep for most people. And oh great, you're going to have a baby, here's what you should start preparing on, you're taking a long distance flight in a different time zone. And so I almost wonder if when you see humans kind of incorporate these capabilities in our lives, it starts with something really small that is easy to kind of follow through and use, but has impact and is sort of valuable.
Yeah.
And so again, we're just brainstorming here, but if we think of the last decade was about measurement and understanding and just recognizing the importance of sleep and sleep debt and the role it plays, the next decade is about, I think it's about change. It's about how do you influence it and how do you manipulate it and how do you bring it as a tool that we control as a society.
Yeah, and it's also really hard because like it's really hard to measure a lot of that too. So like we run into this. How do we know the intervention's effective, right? Like if you download Rise and you get your sleep debt down, it's hard for us to know whether or not that was actually the case because we don't have the counterfactual for you. We don't know what you would have done without that information. And so yeah, we could do like group studies but just like a good example when we started with Northwestern football that's sort of interesting and I think is why change can be really hard to even study is like, Northwestern football, we had two groups. Both groups actually, as school started, their sleep got worse. Basically, they had way less sleep and they were obviously way higher sleep debt. And so you could say, hey, we like launched this intervention, it got worse. What you actually saw is the group that was sort of maintain, at the time it was a sleep scheduling system. So the group that was getting the sleep schedule system just decreased less than they otherwise would have. And so I think getting smarter about how we measure change is also, to your point, something that we'll have to.
But again, and I think we could probably talk about this for hours and should take your parting thoughts in just a minute. But I think the measurement of biological processes and clinical outcomes, I mean, that's not unique to sleep.
No,
right? I mean, there's a reason why clinical trials are done a certain way. There's a reason why so much effort has to go into any new treatment or drug or therapeutic making it to the market. And so I think while that point is really, really important, I think it's also a space where we can learn from perhaps other aspects of healthcare and medicine and apply that to the intervention of how we manipulate sleep and I think do it in a more of a clinically robust and statistically robust manner, right? But I know we can talk for hours, but I think we will have to wrap up. And so maybe
yeah.
things you want to say, parting thoughts, comments. I mean, obviously, it's been a total delight to kind of have this conversation, and really a conversation that we've had many times over the last decade, I would say. But what else do you want to share? Anything you want to highlight before we wrap up?
What's top of mind for me is, how there is so much, I think, around technology and wellness and like people are spending a lot of money on it. And it's just something that when we think about what we try and do every day, how do we make sure that we're building a business that is delivering real human outcomes? And that'll be the continuous challenge is like, how do you do that at greater and greater scale? How do you do it continuously? How do you continue to rapidly improve on the change side, which I think you're right about the next decade of that being such a key focus. But it's upsetting seeing so many different technologies, whether it's in mental health or within sleep or in other categories, where what people are buying is actually either A, just entertainment, or B, actively harming.
Yeah.
And getting them focused on the wrong things. And so there's just a lot out there, and there isn't a good regulatory environment for that because these things aren't medical devices. So it's this weird, now people are going to TikTok to get their medical advice, right? They're going on Google to get their medical advice. The whole world around health has now changed, I think, to very different sources than what used to be the case. And so I think there's just a lot of exciting potential for good and for bad.
And I think those two have to converge at some point.
Yeah.
And there's going to be a whole bunch of, which sleep devices are comparable to sleep study and meet a certain validation bar and which ones do not might be something that changes in the next few years. Yeah.
Right.
Leon, any parting thoughts? What else do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, and that's, I would say, the extremely exciting aspect, right? Like where you were saying, 10 years ago, even when we started, tracking sleep was this thing that would cost you thousands of dollars, all these like expensive researching devices that would last, had a battery of 24 hours. And now fast forward to not only sleep, but a lot of other categories. And basically you have hundreds of millions of people, maybe billions at this point, with pretty high fidelity sort of clinical and biological data. So we're kind of running this massive, human experiment across all sort of how do we just make life better? And that's just what's incredibly exciting, right? Like we're just at a point that technology as a whole can directly help hundreds of millions of people with sort of clinical and biological data, where the impact, I think, is going to be tremendous, as you're saying, where now tracking is sort of done and how do we lead to change across sleep, but all other sort of energy, nutrition, mental health, all sort of aspects of human health. So it's going to be a fun time.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be a fun time and a lot of interesting puzzles to solve. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for taking our time for your afternoon and joining us again on the Autonomous Health Podcast. It's been a real treat and a privilege. And congrats on all the success, and excited to see what else you guys work on in the coming time at Rise.
Awesome. Thanks, Admiral. This is fun.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us on.
For everybody listening, once again, thanks again for listening. This is the Autonomous Health Podcast. We will try to release our episodes on a regular cadence, and you should be able to find them online as well as in your favorite podcast app. So once again, thanks again. This is Anmol, and have a good rest of your day.